I don't like to dwell too much publicly on the mistakes that I've made in Christian ministry. It's too embarrassing, and some of you are new to church, and I don't want you to think too badly of me, but this was one of the mistakes I've made in Christian ministry, and it was pretty bad. We had planned here at Village Church a marriage enrichment seminar. We planned it months in advance, like maybe 9 months in advance. And we'd set the date, we'd invited some external speakers in, they were to come, it was from 9 till 12, it was going to be a really good morning. It was all prepared. And then a couple who were from Village Evenings asked me if I could speak at their wedding. They got engaged and they got married. It all happened quite quickly, and they asked me if I would speak at the wedding, and they said the date is 2:00 on that same Saturday afternoon, but it was down at Caringbah in the Sutherland Shire. And I thought, okay, that's fine. What I'll do is marriage seminar 9 till 12, wedding at 2:00. I'll wear clothes pretty much like these, but you might notice I'm wearing nice black shoes tonight instead of the other shoes that I would. And what I'll do is I'll get my suit together, and when I leave home at 8 to go to the marriage seminar, I'll take the suit with me. And I didn't realise I was walking out of our house, and as I was walking out of our house, the trousers fell off the rail, and I didn't notice. And so I was completely unaware of this. Went to the marriage seminar. And one of the things I've noticed, I've done a lot of weddings, and if the bride's late, there's forgiveness. If the groom's late, there's forgiveness. If the minister's late, there's no forgiveness. And so I've made it a thing to be at the wedding, if I'm officiating at the wedding, about an hour before the wedding starts, just in case, so that there's wriggle room. Anyway. The marriage seminar here at Village finished at midday. The wedding was at 2:00. I chatted with people for a little bit afterwards till perhaps 12:15, 20 past 12. I drove down there. I got there. It was 20 past 1. I went to the bathroom at the church, put the jacket on, got the white shirt on. I won't actually reenact this, take my shirt off in front of you all, but put the jacket on, and then put the tie on, and then to my absolute horror, there were no black trousers. It was 25 to 2. Could I race down to, Myer at Caringbah or something? And the wedding party, they weren't quite top hat, but they were kind of super formal. And I wasn't officiating at the ceremony, but the Bible reading happened, and I got up to do the talk, and I could just feel everybody looking and thinking, what is he doing wearing those clothes? It was awful. Now, I had been rude to the bride and bridegroom. Unintentionally rude, but I was rude. And I did look for an opportunity after the wedding, when the couple were back from their honeymoon, to apologise to them. Now, why am I telling you all that? Because we're looking today at a story that Jesus tells of a wedding banquet about somebody who has the wrong clothes. And I just want you to help me with this, and we'll just get our context properly sorted for a minute. So just look back in chapter 22, look back to chapter 21 to verse 23 of chapter 21. And the whole interaction, it's just a couple of days before Jesus' death. It's taking place in Jerusalem in the temple courts. So if you look at 21:23, when he, that's Jesus, entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority?" Now, what we're doing tonight in Matthew chapter 22 is we're picking up a conversation 2/3 of the way through, quite a strong confrontation. And round one of the confrontation, we saw this last week, was the parable of the two sons. One son promises to be obedient, but in the end wasn't, and the other son isn't expected to be obedient, and then in the end does what he was told. And so the punchline, if you look at 21 verse 31, and this is me paraphrasing, 21:31, "You religious leaders of the Jews, you're the ones who said you'd do the right thing, but you haven't. And yet these tax collectors and prostitutes, they never said they were going to do the right thing, and they've ended up responding properly to God. Their next round, and we saw this last week with Alex, of Jesus' argument was the parable of the tenants. Jesus tells a story of a man who rents a vineyard. The landlord sends out his workers to collect the rent, and the tenants beat, stoned, and killed the workers. And then the landlord sends his son, thinking they'll respect my son. They kill the son. And we were meant to see last week from Alex that God is the landlord, the Son is Jesus, and in a few days' time the religious leaders are going to kill God's Son, and that God will be very angry. Now we get to chapter 22, and Jesus tells the story of a king inviting his guests to a wedding banquet. Now, clearly in the story, God is the king. The Son is Jesus. The first round guests, they're the Jewish leaders. The slaves who issue the invitation, they're the servants of the king. And the banquet, well, there's an ambiguity. It's the wedding banquet of the Son, so it could be the imminent expectation of the banquet in heaven, or it could be provisional fulfillment now. Coming to the banquet could be a metaphor for becoming a Christian. Now, just incidentally, and some of you will know this, there's another story in the gospel accounts, a very similar story, and I think in our circles a more famous one. As I've reflected on my preparation for this today, I think the story in Luke 14 of the banquet, I think I've probably taught that passage, 14, 15, 16, maybe even 20 times. Whereas I've taught this passage in Matthew 22 very many fewer times. Now that story in Luke 14, it's central in our Introducing God course, which is why quite a lot of people would have interacted with it over the years. But what I don't want to happen tonight is you to think, look, I'm familiar with the Luke 14 story, so I don't need to listen to this one, because there are all sorts of different things going on in this passage versus Luke 14. So let me just give them to you. You might want to jot these down. Luke 14, it's a story about a certain man. Matthew 22, it's about a king. Luke 14, it's a story about a party. Matthew 22, it's about a wedding banquet for the king's son. Luke 14, there's one round of rejection from the guests. Matthew 22, there are two rounds of rejection. Luke 14, the guests are all passive rejectors. Matthew 22, some are passive, but some of the guests who reject, they mistreat and murder the people who delivered the invites. Luke 14, the guests who reject are passed by. Matthew 22, the guests who reject are killed and their city is burnt down. They are different stories, Luke 14 and Matthew 22, told by Jesus at different times with a different message. Now, let's get to point 3. Jump in. The generous king invites many people to his son's wedding, or God is inviting a zillion people to the wedding banquet of heaven. Now, Matthew 22:1, once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to summon those invited to the banquet. Now, just for a minute, soak in here the generosity of God. It is a privilege to be invited to a wedding. It's an honour. A wedding invite is a gift. You cannot demand an invitation to a wedding. And if you have the privilege of being invited to a wedding, then you are an honoured guest. And it is rude to reject the invitation. But you notice, verse 3, but they didn't want to come. We're not told why they didn't want to come. And at this point, their rejection, well, you could probably categorise it as, passive avoidance. They didn't want to come. And so we go to second round invites. And the king, he wants to honour his son. I don't think the king is desperate. We'll read along verse 4. He sent out other servants and said, Tell those who are invited, 'See, I've prepared my dinner. My oxen, my fattened calf have been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' They refuse. We're told why this time. Sentence 5. But they paid no attention and went away, one to his own farm, another to his business." Now, if we draw the parallel between the wedding banquet and God inviting us to heaven, well, there are people who stay away from relationship with God. There are people who stay away from heaven and the joy of celebrating with God in heaven because of commerce. They put work too high a priority. And you might have heard yourself think this. You might have heard yourself think, "I'm too busy with work to focus on God and his goodness for me. I'm too busy with work to celebrate God and his goodness with me. I'm too busy to think about the things of God. I'm too busy to read the Bible. I'm too busy to pray." And the reality is, if you think like that, even a little bit, you're slighting the King. And when we say that in our heads to God, we're slighting God. We're saying, "There's more important things in my life than you, God." The people in Jesus' story neglect the marriage ceremony of his son. They neglect the marriage ceremony of his son. But it's more than they neglect the marriage ceremony of his son. Some of them, verse 6, the rest seized the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. Some who reject the invitation to the banquet of the wedding of God's Son don't do it passively. Their rejection of God's invitation is active, intentional, public, violent, murderous. Now, I think there's absolutely no doubt that in the first place, this story from Jesus coming where it does in Matthew 22, which you can see is just like a couple of days before his execution in Matthew 26. He's about a week away from being executed. And this moment where Jesus is having this confrontation outside the temple with the chief priests and the elders, and we saw the parable of the tenants last week with Alex and the story of the Jews rejecting the capstone, 21:42. There's absolutely no doubt that Jesus is looking at those Jewish leaders in the eye, 21:23, and he's saying, "This story is about you." Look at 21:45. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they knew he was speaking about them. That's just a few verses before the end of last chapter. And here we are at the beginning of this chapter, and Jesus is talking about them again in a parable. But when he speaks of people, verse 6, who seize the messengers, who kill the messengers, he's not just, I think, talking about the first century Jewish elders and Jewish leaders. He's alluding to down through every age when the messengers of God who go out are killed for proclaiming Jesus, for inviting people to God's banquet in heaven. And so I looked up on the web this week, the Open Doors website, the website for the Christian organisation that looks at helping Christians in places of the world where Christians are persecuted. And on the Open Doors website, it said at the moment, we'll put it up on the screen, North Korea is the most dangerous country in the world to be a Christian. And they list out on that website all the dangerous countries to be a Christian. And you see on the next page, those orange dots, They're the places where a Christian is in danger for going out and speaking, inviting to the banquet. Where a Christian who goes out and invites to the banquet is most likely to be seized, mistreated and killed. North Korea is the most dangerous country, but you've got Somalia, Libya, Eritrea, Yemen. Now, much, much, much less dramatic, but orders of magnitude less dramatic, but actually still the same pushback. One of our boys at school was thick as thieves with another boy from his school, and we were building a strong relationship with the family, our family, their family, and their mum was over at our place, and we invited them to something here at church. I think it was something like our gingerbread wreath making night, something like that. And it was pretty soft. And it surprised me because I said, we're doing gingerbread and wreath making in a few weeks at church. Could be a really fun night. And I've now worked out as I've reflected back on it that she was expecting at some point me to invite her to something, and she had written in her head this speech to give me to tell me why she would not be coming. And all the reasons she couldn't come and wouldn't come, and she just backpedaled 1,000 miles and backpedaled on our boy's friendship, and I just felt it was kind of a distancing, kind of an estrangement. And I just want to say that could happen to you. You could invite somebody to Easter at Village Church, to the Meet Jesus, or you could invite somebody to the big Introducing God course when we started on the 28th of July, and you'll cop a flag, cop a distancing, cop a mocking, cop a ridicule. What does God do? What does God do when he sends a messenger to invite to the banquet to mark the wedding of his son, and the people that he sent to invite to the wedding are killed? Look at verse 7. The king was enraged. God is angry with those who reject him. When you or I reject God, it is personal for him. Someone in my family opened a car door, banged the next door car in the car park. It was a super nice car, and it now had a super big dent. And the letter came from their insurance company, and it was a super expensive excess. So I get this letter from Amy, Car Insurance. Does anybody here work for Amy? No. It could be that you were here tonight and you work for Amy, but I suspect you would still be prepared to have dinner with me after church. In that could have happened and we could still be friends. But it's not like that here. When we reject God, either passively or actively, when we reject the invitation to God's party, God is personally wounded. God is personally hurt. God is personally angry. He is enraged. Trigger warning moment. You ready? Trigger warning. A woman I love. Not my wife, not my daughter, but part of our wider family. She was visiting Paris. She was a tourist, and she was abducted and sexually assaulted. And it was awful. It's had a massive, massive impact on her. And her reaction, our family's reaction, it is not at all like a car door has a ding and it can be fixed by paying the excess. She has been deeply, deeply, deeply hurt, deeply impacted, and we are enraged. There is a deep anger. And God sent his servant to invite us to the banquet of the wedding of his Son. And people killed the people who brought the invitations. When those recipients kill the inviters, it is a deep personal affront to God, and God is enraged. What does God do to those who seize, kill his messengers? He sentenced 7, sent out his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned down their city. This is the judgment of God. The tone, the violence here on the part of the Almighty is at first glance startling. But if you've been with us in church the last few weeks, and you see actually that the chief priests and the elders were opposing Jesus, who's from God. And they've got a history of seizing God's prophets and killing them. And they're about to seize God's Son and kill him. So God judges them. Why does God judge them? We're told, actually, the very next verse, verse 8, then he told his servants, the banquet's ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. The people who were invited and who rejected and who killed the messenger, they were not worthy. The leaders of the Jews, the Jewish chief priests and the elders, they've rejected the messenger of God. They were not worthy of a seat at the banquet. So what does the God do, the generous king do? Expands the invitation to others. And the implication is, in the first place, when the Jewish leaders reject the invitation to the banquet of God's Son Jesus, God will invite others. And the guests, the new round of guests, they're the non-Jews, the Gentiles. This is you and me in this story. I mean, I take it most of us aren't of Jewish heritage. We weren't on the first round invitation. We weren't by blood children of Abraham. And so God's servants now, they come around to the gates at the edges of the city. They find us, they invite us. And in fact, this could even be what is happening right now. Like right this second now. What we're attempting to do as a church, village church, is to gather people around, invite people to come to the banquet. So come to the banquet, come fill up the seats in the banquet of God. And so I can say tonight, explicitly commissioned by Jesus to you tonight, I can say, come to God's banquet. There's an invitation to God's banquet. Come to the party. Come honour God's Son. I am saying this tonight to you, verse 9. And being inviting anyone and everyone I can get to listen to me. I'm saying, come. It's a gilt-edged invitation in gold. And it's free. Freely available to you. I mean, it costs. Jesus pays for it. But for you, it is free. Now, that's where I got to in my preparation for you tonight. I was working through the commentaries, thinking about this. And I just got to verses 8 and 9. And the commentator, John Nolan, stopped me in my tracks with just these few sentences that I'm going to give you now. He said, it is a standing temptation, especially for religious leaders, to subconsciously think of their relationship with God as one of codependence, i.e., that God needs me, us, as much as we need God. So what happens is religious leaders think they're good. Religious leaders think they're better. Religious leaders are tempted to think God is lucky to have me on the team. And I'm at this point speaking to you if you're a community group leader, to you if you're a youth group leader, to you if you're a kids' church leader, to you if you lead in the band or play in the band or serve in prayer or serve in Bible reading or serve in any of the ways around Village Church. These religious leaders, they think they're good, they think they're better, and those of us in Christian leadership, there's this subtle, seductive, insidious, wicked, sneaky lie that tempts and manipulates those of us in leadership. And you know what though? This is really clear. God can get along quite well without the Jewish religious leaders. In fact, Matthew chapter 3 verse 9, God is able from stones to raise up children of Abraham. God is not desperate in his recruitment of replacement guests. Rather, what happens is God's heart is one of generous extravagance, not desperation. All the initiative for the invitation to the banquet is on the part of God, not the guests. That I get to go to the banquet, that you get to go to the banquet, that any of us is on the in, is only and all and exclusively due to the generosity of God. Now, point 5, change in pace, change in scene even. We're inside the banquet now. Verse 11, the king comes into the banquet and he sees someone not properly dressed. Verse 11, when the king came in to view the guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed for the wedding. People do dress up for special occasions. And for the king's son's wedding, you should wear your best clothes. And one guest is visually obvious for not having bothered. Why do clothes matter at a wedding? They're a mark of respect to the host. Even more so, actually, why do clothes matter at a funeral? They're a mark of respect for the person who's died, for the family. I went along to a funeral, a big funeral. It was in the cathedral, actually. There was 600 people there. There were 300 men in suits and 300 women in kind of correspondingly formal dress. But there was one young man there in a T-shirt. And I looked at him with all these other people in full. And actually, first thing I thought of immediately was don't be a judge. Be sympathetic. His trousers could have fallen off the rail. I did want to give him the benefit of the doubt. But actually, as I thought about him and what I knew of him, I don't think it was that. Well, firstly, it wasn't his trousers, it was a T-shirt. But I think he was actually being disrespectful. Disrespectful to the man who died and disrespectful to those who were grieving, who were close to him. And he had come on his own terms. And he hadn't properly honoured the man. What happens here, verse 12, is he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" The king gives the guest a chance to explain, to say, "Oh, look, I meant no dishonour. I was leaving home this morning and my trousers fell off the coat hanger and I meant to do the right thing, and then there was only 25 minutes." But what does it say, verse 12? The man was speechless. It is his guilty silence that condemns him. Now, what's the message for us? We need to grasp the impossibility of coming to the wedding feast of God's Son on our own terms. The man in the wrong clothes, he doesn't accept that. If you are offered and accept the invitation to the king's banquet, then you are to come on the terms set down by the king. What? what happens if I don't? Why shouldn't I be a person who is badly dressed, who comes to the wedding on my own terms? Well, look what happens, 13. The king told the attendants, tie him up, hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen. And the implication is that although the invitation is broad, it does not follow that all the invited actually get to stay and eat. And that this man is tied up, I take it, carries the implication that he cannot get up and come back in, but he is permanently expelled. What's the takeaway message tonight? First takeaway message: whoever you are, whatever you've done, welcome to the kingdom of heaven. Come to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus has appointed me tonight as a messenger to invite you to the kingdom of heaven. Are you struggling with a sin? Come to the kingdom of heaven. Welcome to the kingdom of heaven. Rest on that Jesus has paid for your entry. Look back to chapter 21, 31. The people that Jesus was ministering to, they involved tax collectors and sinners. The people that Jesus is ministering to, they include porn addicts and gambling addicts and sex addicts. They include thieves and liars. They include violent people. Whatever it is that you have done, forgiveness is yours in Jesus. Acceptance is yours in Jesus. Takeaway message 2. Do not think you're worthy. Do not think you're better. Do not think there's a codependent relationship between you and God. Do not for a moment imagine that God needs you. Rather, if you come, those who come on the initiative, the invitation of God. Takeaway message 3. We must not, we cannot entertain the idea that we as individuals or we as a group can approach the Almighty on our own terms, in our clothes of choice. We cannot be a person, we cannot be a fellowship that says to God, we want to come to you, God, but only on my terms. For that would be an attitude that is militantly unrepentant of sin. Rather, you and I are to be people, as individuals and as a group, who say, God, I gratefully accept your invitation and I come on your terms. So application tonight. First, God is generously inviting you and giving you the task of being involved in the inviting. And when you invite, know that it is your job to, as a slave, as a servant, to issue the invitation to the wedding banquet of God's Son, Jesus. And so the graphics that we've got about Meet Jesus as we invite people to church, as we invite people to our Introducing God, all in course, in term 3. When somebody accepts God's generosity, rejoice. Rejoice that they're at God's party in heaven. And there are quite a few here even tonight who've accepted God's invitation in the last few months, and so we're baptising you on Easter Sunday night. Secondly, if you have been invited to heaven, accept the invitation. What a crazy decision it would be to say no to the wedding banquet. Especially a wedding banquet to honour Jesus, and especially actually if you're the bride of the bridegroom Jesus. For in the Bible there's a mixing of a metaphor here that we are in one place guests at the wedding banquet, and in another place we're invited to be the bride of Jesus. It's a unity of a beautiful relationship between us as a people and our bridegroom Jesus. And the invitation is held out for you and me, deep, personal, intimate relationship with the Son of God, of being known and knowing, of trusting and closeness and valued by him. And ultimately the Lord Jesus lays down his life for us, his bride. So accept the invitation. Thirdly, are you wearing the right clothes? Come on his terms, not your terms. One of my minister's friends at a different church, he said to me, lots of people at my church have really strong racist thoughts. And he's had to say to them, you cannot wear racist clothes to God's wedding banquet for his son in heaven. You can't wear racist clothes. Another of my minister friends is in a church full of wealthy people, and he finds himself saying to them, you cannot wear greedy clothes to God's wedding banquet for his son in heaven. Or another of my minister friends told me about parents angry with the staff at his church for encouraging the young professional children to give up their lives in service of Christ in the full-time ministry. And for these particular parents, they were wearing the clothes of ambition, the clothes of secular ambition. And they wanted to come to God on their terms, not on God's terms. And the minister friend had to say to those parents, the problem is that you are wearing the clothes of ambition. What about Village Church? What kind of clothes are we tempted to? I don't think it's racism. I don't think in this church I see many people wearing racist clothes. I don't think it's... Actually, I don't even think it's greed. I mean, some of us may be. What about ambition? Well, some of us may be. I wonder, for us, if an application might be, rather than taking off a particular jumper or a particular pair of trousers or a particular shirt, it might be putting some particular clothes on to come into the wedding. I've been thinking about the words of Jesus in John chapter 13, verse 34. We'll put it up on the screen. I give you a new command. Love one another. This is Jesus speaking. As I have loved you, you must love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. I've mentioned this story before, but some people, a family joined our church from a country church, and they ended up leaving after a year, and they said to me, Village Church is not a loving community. And I didn't get it at first, and I felt quite defensive. You can see it in my body language now. And then I went and talked to a wise ministry lecturer at Moore College, Archie Poulos, actually. And he helped me see that he didn't think Village Church was any less loving than Petersham Anglican, or less loving than Petersham Baptist, or less loving than Drummoyne Presbyterian, or less loving than Barney's Broadway, or any of the other inner city churches. And so I was tempted to brush it off and say, well, people in the country, they've got more time to bake scones for each other than people in the inner city. But somebody wise once said to me, every time you're criticised, Dominic, there'll be lots in the criticism that isn't right and isn't fair. But there's almost always a kernel of truth in there somewhere in the criticism that if you've got ears to hear, you will learn from. And so I want to suggest that we shouldn't just pass it off as an inner city thing, but rather we should actually genuinely attempt to have a look and to see if we as a church could more intentionally put on the clothes of love. Love for one another. Love of quality time, love of investing in each other's lives, love of going having lunch with each other during the week, love of acts of service, love of gifts, love of reassuring words, but love of laying down your life. That's how Jesus loved. Intentionally caring for each other, loving like Jesus loved. And to come to the banquet wearing the clothes of love.